That summer evening, I found myself standing by the window in Greg's house, peeling off my sweat-soaked shirt after a long, tiring day. I'd been visiting Greg for years. He was my closest friend, and staying at his place always felt like a second home. However, this visit was different. His son, Ethan, was also staying with us, and he wasn't the boy I remembered. Ethan had grown into a young man of 19, tall and athletic, possessing a self-assured aura that was difficult to overlook. As I stripped down to change into something more comfortable, I couldn't help but reflect on his transformation. It stirred an unexpected feeling within me, one I hadn't anticipated. Just as I tossed my shirt onto the bed, a soft knock echoed from the door. Before I could respond, the door creaked open, revealing Ethan standing in the doorway. His eyes widened at the sight of me undressed, and he paused momentarily, his gaze lingering a beat too long, taking in more than I felt comfortable with. I didn't know you were in here," he stammered, clearly surprised. But instead of leaving, he remained rooted to the spot, his eyes fixed on me. I quickly grabbed the shirt from the bed and draped it over my shoulders, attempting to diffuse the awkwardness. "No harm done," I said, trying to sound casual, though inwardly I was anything but. Ethan still didn't move, his hand resting on the doorframe. He glanced back at me, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. There was a definite tension, an unspoken something hanging in the air between us. "I should go," he finally murmured, but he didn't seem in any hurry. He closed the door softly behind him, leaving me standing there, heart racing, uncertain about what had just transpired. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just an uncomfortable moment we'd both forget by morning. But the truth was, something had undeniably shifted between us. Ethan wasn't a kid anymore. There was a boldness in his gaze that caught me off guard, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of attraction towards him that I couldn't explain. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind replayed the scene, the way his eyes lingered, the way he hesitated at the door. It was as if he was waiting for something, and I wasn't sure what. But one thing was certain. Things had changed between us, and I wasn't sure I was prepared for what was to come. The following morning, I woke with a heavy feeling in my chest. I couldn't shake off the previous night's events. Ethan's eyes, his presence in the doorway, the way he looked at me. It was all too vivid. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just an awkward encounter, but deep down I knew it was more than that. When I went downstairs, Greg was already awake, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper. He greeted me as usual, completely unaware of the tension that had settled between me and his son. I forced a smile, hoping to appear normal, but it was difficult to erase the image of Ethan standing in my room the night before. Then Ethan entered the kitchen, with the same quiet confidence, wearing a t-shirt and jeans, casual, yet striking. Our eyes met for a fleeting moment, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. He gave me a small smile, as if nothing had happened, but I could still sense the unspoken tension lingering between us. Greg was oblivious, utterly unaware of the undercurrent flowing between his son and me. As we sat down for breakfast, I could feel Ethan's eyes on me periodically, but whenever I looked up, he'd quickly avert his gaze. It felt like we were both waiting for the other to acknowledge the shift that had occurred, yet neither of us dared to address it. After breakfast, Greg announced he was running errands, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house. The moment he left, the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. I tried to occupy myself, reasoning that if I focused on something, anything, I could avoid thinking about Ethan. But every time I turned a corner, I felt his presence, as if he was watching, waiting for the opportune moment. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. He found me in the living room, standing near the window, lost in thought. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. I didn't want to have this conversation. I didn't want to acknowledge what was happening. "About last night?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ethan nodded, stepping closer. "Yeah, about last night." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "It was nothing. Let's just forget it." But Ethan shook his head, his eyes locked on mine. I don't want to forget it, he said softly. I liked it. The words struck me like a physical blow. My mind raced, struggling to comprehend the situation. I should have told him we couldn't do this, that it was wrong. But instead, I stood there, frozen, my heart racing. And in that moment, I realized that I liked it too. After Ethan's confession, the air between us grew even heavier. I liked it. Those words reverberated in my mind. Each syllable deepened the already simmering tension. I knew I should have stopped him right there, told him it couldn't happen again. But I couldn't. Something about the way he looked at me, the way his eyes lingered, made it impossible to walk away. Ethan remained before me, his expression bold yet uncertain, as if waiting for my reaction. My heart hammered in my chest, and my hands felt clammy. I tried to speak, but words failed me. All I could do was stand there, caught in his gaze, feeling the weight of the unspoken hanging between us. We can't do this, I finally whispered. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew I wasn't entirely convinced. Why not? Ethan asked, his voice calm, almost playful. No one has to know. That line sent a shiver down my spine. The temptation was overwhelming, a force pulling me toward him. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to stop, to walk away before things went too far. But the rest of me, the part that craved the connection we'd unexpectedly found, couldn't resist. I swallowed hard, stepping back, trying to create some physical distance between us. This is wrong. Your dad... Ethan cut me off, stepping closer, his eyes dark with intensity. What he doesn't know won't hurt him. I opened my mouth to respond, to push him away, but before I could, he reached out and touched my arm, sending a jolt through my body. His touch was gentle yet firm, the kind that made my pulse quicken. I looked at his hand on my arm, and instead of pulling away, I let it remain. Ethan moved even closer, closing the gap between us. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, his breath brushing my skin as he leaned in. Everything inside me screamed that this was a mistake, but I couldn't stop myself. Before I knew what was happening, his lips were on mine. The kiss was electric, charged with all the unspoken desire that had been building between us. It wasn't soft or hesitant. It was raw, passionate, as if we both acknowledged we were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His hands slid up my arms, pulling me closer, and I responded in kind, letting go of all the doubt that had been holding me back. For a moment, everything else disappeared. It was just Ethan and me, lost in the heat of the moment, the weight of our secret drowning out everything else. But then, as quickly as it began, reality hit me like a wave. I pulled back, my breath shaky, my mind racing. We shouldn't have done that, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Ethan smiled, that same mischievous grin that always made my heart race. Maybe. But we both wanted it. And the truth was, I couldn't deny it. I did want it. And from the look in his eyes, I knew this was far from over. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and lingering glances. Ethan and I continued to circle each other like two people caught in a dangerous game, both aware of the consequences, yet unable to stop. Every time Greg wasn't around, the air between us crackled with tension, a constant reminder of the kiss we'd shared and the lines we'd crossed. I tried to act normal, to pretend nothing had changed, but the truth was, everything had. Ethan had awakened something within me that I hadn't realized was there, and now that it was out in the open, I couldn't suppress it. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. Greg, completely oblivious to what was happening between his son and me, continued to treat me like family, making it even more difficult to face him. Every time I looked at him, guilt gnawed at me. And yet, the pull toward Ethan only intensified. It was as if I was living two lives, one where everything was normal, and another where I was consumed by this secret desire. One evening, Greg had to work late, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house. The moment he left, I felt the familiar tension descend. I tried to distract myself, reading, watching TV, even going for a run, But it was no use. My mind kept drifting back to Ethan, to the way he had kissed me, the way his hands had felt on my skin. I was sitting on the couch when Ethan entered, his expression unreadable. He sat down next to me, a little too close, his leg brushing against mine. I could feel the heat radiating from him, and my heart began to race. "We shouldn't," I said quietly, avoiding his gaze. "But you want to," Ethan replied, his voice steady, almost teasing. "I know you do." I turned to face him, our eyes meeting. There was something in his gaze that made it impossible to look away, an intensity, a certainty that I hadn't expected. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was, I did want it, even though I knew how wrong it was. Ethan leaned in, his hand lightly brushing against mine, and that was all it took. Before I knew it, we were kissing again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if we were both savoring the moment. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I didn't resist. The tension that had been building between us for days finally snapped, and I gave in to the desire that had been consuming me. But as the kiss deepened, a wave of guilt washed over me. I pulled back, my breath ragged, my mind racing. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ethan didn't seem fazed. He just smiled, that same mischievous grin that always made my heart skip a beat. "Then why can't you stop?" he asked, his voice soft but challenging. I didn't have an answer. The truth was I wasn't sure I could stop, and the more I gave in, the harder it became to even want to. As the days went by, the weight of our secret grew heavier. Every time I saw Greg, my stomach twisted in knots. He had no idea what was going on, no clue about the betrayal happening right under his nose. Ethan and I had crossed a line that I never thought I'd even approach, and now I found myself trapped in this tangled web of desire and guilt. Greg remained the same, friendly, trusting, and completely unaware of the tension that filled the air whenever Ethan and I were in the same room. Every time he smiled at me or asked about my day, the guilt intensified. The deception was eating away at me, yet the desire for Ethan remained a powerful, unrelenting force. How long could I maintain this charade? How long before he noticed something was amiss? One evening, after Greg had retired early, Ethan and I found ourselves alone again. The silence in the house was deafening, the kind that seemed to amplify every unspoken thought and hidden desire. I tried to avoid eye contact, tried to convince myself we could simply sit there as if nothing was happening between us. But the moment Ethan sat beside me on the couch, I knew that was impossible. "I can't keep doing this," I whispered, more to myself than to him. My voice trembled with the weight of the lie I was living. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He just looked at me, his expression soft yet knowing. "You've said that before," he finally said, his voice low. "But you always come back." I shook my head, feeling the internal battle raging within me. "This is wrong, Ethan. Your dad—" "My dad doesn't need to know," Ethan interrupted, his voice calm, almost too calm. He moved closer, his hand resting on my knee. "We're not hurting anyone." But the truth was, we were. Every time I looked at Greg, every time I thought about the friendship we'd built over the years, I knew that what Ethan and I were doing wasn't just a betrayal of his trust. It was a betrayal of everything I believed in. I wasn't the type of person who did this. Or at least, I hadn't been until now. Ethan's hand slid up my leg, sending a shiver through me. The temptation was always there, always lingering just beneath the surface. It was like a drug, and no matter how much I told myself to stop, I couldn't resist. His presence was intoxicating, and each time we touched, it felt like we were stepping further and further into dangerous territory. I grabbed his hand, stopping him before things went any further. "We need to stop," I said, my voice firmer this time, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Ethan met my gaze, his eyes filled with that same intensity that always made my heart race. "Do you really want to stop?" he asked softly, his hand still resting on mine. For a long moment I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't want to stop, but the longer we continued, the more the guilt ate away at me, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could bear it. Despite my best efforts, it became impossible to deny what was happening between Ethan and me. The pull I felt toward him, the way his presence seemed to consume me, it was stronger than the guilt, stronger than the shame. I had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Every moment we spent together felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between desire and disaster. Greg remained blissfully unaware, continuing with his daily routines as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Every time Ethan and I were alone, it felt like we were dancing on the edge of a precipice, something that could explode in our faces at any moment. And yet, I couldn't stop. One afternoon, Greg had to go out of town for a few days for work. The moment he told us, I felt my stomach drop. Being alone with Ethan for that long, it was a temptation I wasn't sure I could handle. But I nodded, pretending everything was fine, while my mind raced with the possibilities. As soon as Greg left, the tension between Ethan and me became palpable. I tried to keep my distance, to occupy myself with anything other than the thoughts swirling in my head. But Ethan wasn't one to give me space. He sought me out, as if he knew I couldn't resist him. It wasn't long before he found me in the guest room, sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to focus on the book I'd been pretending to read. He walked in, his steps slow and deliberate, and closed the door behind him. "We're alone now," he said softly, his voice laced with that same teasing edge that always made my pulse quicken. "No one's going to know." I looked up at him, my heart pounding. "Ethan, we shouldn't—" He cut me off, stepping closer until he was standing directly in front of me. "But we will," he whispered, leaning down until our faces were inches apart. "We both know that." My resolve crumbled. The tension between us had been building for days, and I couldn't hold back any longer. Before I could stop myself, I reached for him, pulling him into a kiss that was hungry, desperate. His hands were on me in an instant, and I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about anything except the way he made me feel. In that moment, we tumbled back onto the bed, our hands everywhere, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. It was reckless, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. For those few stolen hours, nothing else mattered. Not Greg, not the guilt, not the risk of everything coming crashing down around us. It was just Ethan and me, lost in the heat of the moment, crossing lines we could never uncross. But when it was over, and the reality of what we'd done settled in, the weight of our actions came crashing down on me. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with desire. I had gone too far, and there was no going back now. Ethan lay beside me, his breath steady, his fingers lightly tracing patterns on my skin. "You're thinking too much," he said softly, his voice breaking through the silence. "Maybe I should be," I whispered, feeling the heaviness of what had just happened pressing down on me. But even as I said it, I knew it didn't matter. I was in too deep. The morning after felt like waking from a dream I couldn't escape. Ethan was already up by the time I stumbled into the kitchen, his presence there unnervingly casual. He smiled at me like everything was normal, like we hadn't crossed a line the night before that would forever alter the way I saw him, the way I saw myself. But I couldn't smile back. My mind was clouded with guilt, my chest heavy with the weight of what we'd done. Greg would be back soon, and the thought of facing him after everything was suffocating. How was I supposed to act like nothing had happened? How was I supposed to sit across from him at the dinner table, pretending I wasn't betraying him in the worst possible way? Ethan, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. He hummed softly to himself as he made coffee, his movements relaxed, as if the secret we shared wasn't eating me alive. "You're too quiet," Ethan said, breaking the silence, his voice light and teasing. He glanced over his shoulder at me, a mischievous smile playing on his lips. "Thinking too much again?" I leaned against the counter, rubbing a hand over my face. "How can you be so calm about this?" I asked, my voice strained. Ethan shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Because it's not a big deal. No one has to know. We can keep this between us." But it was a big deal. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was wrong, that what we were doing wasn't just a betrayal of Greg's trust, it was a betrayal of myself. I wasn't this person. I wasn't the kind of man who crossed these lines, who gave in to temptation without considering the consequences. But with Ethan, everything felt different, and I couldn't understand why. I pushed myself away from the counter, pacing the length of the kitchen. Greg's going to know something's off. He's not stupid, Ethan. We can't just pretend like nothing happened. Ethan set his mug down and moved toward me, his eyes locking onto mine with that same intensity that always made my heart race. "You're overthinking this," he said softly, his hand reaching out to rest on my arm. "Nothing's going to happen. We just need to keep things under control." But we were already out of control, and I knew it. The stolen moments, the secret touches, the late-night kisses, they were all leading us down a path from which I wasn't sure we could return. Greg returned the next evening, completely unaware of the turmoil that had unfolded in his absence. Watching him walk through the door, his face relaxed and friendly, made my stomach twist into knots. He greeted me like he always did, completely trusting, completely oblivious. I couldn't even look him in the eye. Couldn't. As the days passed, the weight of our secret only grew heavier. Ethan and I still found ways to sneak moments together, but each time it became harder to ignore the guilt. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the pressure building, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave way. The tension between us became harder to hide. Greg started to notice, his easygoing nature slowly giving way to confusion. He asked me once if something was wrong, his voice filled with genuine concern, and I had to lie straight to his face, telling him everything was fine. But everything was far from fine, and deep down I knew this secret wouldn't stay hidden forever. The tension in the house had become almost unbearable. Every glance Greg threw my way felt like a silent accusation, even though I knew he didn't yet suspect anything. But how long could we maintain this charade? Ethan and I were playing with fire, and the flames were licking closer by the day. At first, sneaking around had felt exhilarating. The stolen kisses, the lingering touches when no one was watching. It had given us both a thrill, as though we were getting away with something dangerous. But now, it wasn't fun anymore. It was suffocating. Every time Ethan brushed against me in passing, my heart would pound, not from excitement, but from fear. The fear that Greg would see something, or worse, that I wouldn't be able to hide the guilt that was eating away at me. Ethan seemed so sure of himself, so confident that no one would ever find out, but I wasn't so convinced anymore. Greg had started to notice. I could see it in the way his eyes lingered on me, the way he asked subtle questions about how things were going. He didn't know the full truth, but he knew something was off. It was only a matter of time before he started digging deeper. One evening, Greg invited Ethan and me to join him for a drink outside by the fire pit. We all sat together, but the air between us felt thick with unspoken words. Ethan was his usual self, laughing and joking with his dad, but I could barely focus on the conversation. My mind kept replaying all the moments we'd shared, all the lines we'd crossed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was starting to see through me. At one point, Greg turned to me, his eyes narrowing slightly as he asked, "You've been quiet lately. Everything all right?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My mouth went dry, and for a moment I couldn't think of how to respond. "Yeah," I finally managed to say, forcing a smile. "Just been busy with work, that's all." But even as I said it, I knew the lie wasn't convincing. Greg gave me a long, searching look, and I knew in that moment that the charade was almost over. Ethan glanced over at me, his expression unreadable, but I could tell he was watching the exchange carefully. The conversation moved on, but the tension didn't dissipate. I could feel Greg's eyes on me throughout the evening, as if he were trying to decipher what was really going on. My hands felt clammy, my heart racing in my chest. This was getting out of hand. Later that night, after Greg had retired, I found myself alone with Ethan once again. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the night outside. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching me with that familiar intensity in his eyes. "He's starting to catch on," I said, my voice low and strained. Ethan shrugged, his confidence still unshaken. "He's not going to figure it out. As long as we're careful, everything will be fine." But I wasn't so sure anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the precipice of something terrible, that the walls were closing in faster than we realized. "We need to stop this," I said, more to myself than to him, "before it's too late." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze locked on mine. "You don't want to stop," he whispered, his voice soft but full of certainty. "And neither do I." He was right. As much as I knew we were headed for disaster, I couldn't pull away. I was in too deep, too far gone. But I also knew it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. The following days were a blur of anxiety and fear. Every time I was near Greg, I felt like I was walking on thin ice, waiting for the moment it would crack and I'd plunge into freezing water. The more time passed, the more I sensed his growing suspicion. Ethan and I were slipping, and it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. One evening, Greg asked me to help him with some work in the garage. It was a simple enough task, but I could feel the weight of his eyes on me the entire time. My hands trembled slightly as I handed him tools, trying to keep the conversation light. But Greg wasn't making it easy. He was quieter than usual. His responses clipped, as if he were holding something back. Finally, he set down the wrench he was using and turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You've been acting strange lately," he said, his voice low but direct. "Is there something going on that I should know about?" The question hit me like a hammer. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I couldn't find the words to respond. "No, nothing's going on," I lied, forcing a smile that felt fake even to me. "Just, life." But Greg didn't seem convinced. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "If there's something you're not telling me, I hope you know you can trust me," he said, his tone softer now, but no less intense. "We're friends." I swallowed hard, nodding, but inside I felt like I was going to break. The weight of the lie was crushing me, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it up. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with the fear that Greg was closer to the truth than I wanted to admit. Ethan had reassured me over and over again that everything would be fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were headed for disaster. The next morning, as I sat in the kitchen sipping my coffee, Ethan slipped into the room. His usual confident smile was absent, and for the first time I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked, setting down my mug. Ethan glanced toward the hallway as if making sure Greg wasn't within earshot, then leaned in closer. "I think he's on to us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. My heart sank. "What do you mean?" "I overheard him talking to someone on the phone last night," Ethan explained, his brow furrowed. "He was asking questions about you." Panic hit me hard. My chest tightened, and my mind raced with possibilities. Had Greg already figured it out? Was he just waiting for the right moment to confront us? I couldn't believe it had come to this, but deep down I knew we'd been careless. The sneaking around, the stolen moments, it had all added up, and now we were facing the consequences. "We need to end this," I said, my voice shaking, "before it's too late." But Ethan shook his head, his jaw set in defiance. "No," he said firmly. "We've come this far. I'm not giving up now." I stared at him, my mind reeling. How could he be so sure, so reckless? "Greg is going to find out," I said, my voice rising with panic. "He's already suspicious. We can't keep doing this." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "I don't care," he said, his voice low and intense. "I don't care if he finds out. I want you." The words sent a shockwave through me. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to throw caution to the wind and let everything fall where it may. But the rational part of me knew this was a ticking time bomb, and we were running out of time. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered, stepping back. "It's too much." For the first time, I saw a crack in Ethan's confidence. His eyes darkened with frustration, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there, torn between my desire for him and the crushing guilt that had been building for weeks. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety. Every time Greg spoke to me, I felt like he was testing me, searching for the truth that I was so desperately trying to hide. I couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. All I could do was wait for the moment when everything would come crashing down. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Greg called me into the living room. The serious tone of his voice made my heart race, and I knew without a doubt that this was it. He knew. I sat down across from him, my hands clammy, my heart pounding in my chest. Greg looked at me for a long moment before finally speaking. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. "And I need to know the truth. What's been going on between you and Ethan?" The words hung in the air, suffocating me. I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet, and for the first time I had no idea how to respond. As we come to the end of this story, we're left with a question that lingers long after the final words have been spoken. How far are we willing to go for the things we desire, and at what cost? This tale of secrecy, passion, and betrayal teaches us a valuable lesson about the fragile line between what we want and what we can live with. When we give in to temptation, when we hide our true selves from those we care about, the consequences don't just affect us. They ripple outward, touching the lives of everyone around us. If you found yourself in a similar situation, what would you do? Would you risk everything for a fleeting moment of passion? Or would you make the harder choice to walk away? Sometimes the most difficult decisions are the ones that define who we are. Take a moment to reflect. Are there secrets you've been hiding? Are there desires you've been chasing that could hurt the people closest to you? Maybe it's time to confront those truths and ask yourself what truly matters. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. There's always more to learn, more to reflect on, and more opportunities to grow.